For 13 years, one of Hollywood's quietest marriages sat almost untouched by the two people who lived it. No tell-all interview. No dueling statements. No slow drip of sources say, from either camp. Just a private wedding, a private divorce, and a silence so complete that an entire generation of fans forgot it ever happened at all, including, famously, one of Scarlett Johansson's closest friends. Then, on a podcast couch, almost by accident, that silence cracked open. What came out wasn't a bombshell. It was something quieter and, in its own way, more revealing, an admission about who she was at 23, and why that marriage could never have survived the person she hadn't yet become. Here's the full story of Scarlett Johansson and Ryan Reynolds, how it started, why it ended, and what she finally said about it. To understand why this marriage surprised almost no one and confused almost everyone at the same time, it helps to rewind to who these two people actually were in 2007, before either of them was the household name they'd eventually become. Scarlett Johansson was born in Manhattan in November 1984, one of 5 children in a household that mixed a Danish father's architectural sensibility with a mother's Bronx roots. She started acting as a child, but it was her run through the late 90s and early 2000s, The Horse Whisperer, Ghost World, and then Sofia Coppola's Lost in Translation in 2003, that turned her into one of the most talked-about young actresses in the industry. By her early 20s, she had the kind of critical respect most performers spend a career chasing. Ryan Reynolds' path looked different but moved on a similar timeline. Born in Vancouver in 1976, he cut his teeth on Canadian television before landing the sitcom Two Guys and a Girl in the late 90s, then pivoted into studio comedy with films like National Lampoon's Van Wilder. By the mid-2000s he'd shed the sitcom guy label and was being taken seriously as a leading man, known for a rapid-fire wit that made him a favorite on late-night couches and magazine covers alike. The two met socially in 2007, not long after Reynolds' engagement to singer Alanis Morissette had ended. What followed moved fast enough that friends were reportedly caught off guard by how quickly things escalated. They were engaged within the year and married in September 2008, in a ceremony in Vancouver so tightly controlled that there was no red carpet, no leaked photographer, and almost no advance warning it was happening at all. Johansson was 23. Reynolds was 31. Johansson has said in past interviews that the decision felt instinctive at the time, that she trusted the pull of the relationship without overanalyzing it, the way people often do in their early 20s before they've fully learned what they need from a partner. That phrase, what she needed from a partner, would end up being the exact thread she'd pick back up more than a decade later, on that podcast, to explain everything that came after. The years right after the wedding were also the years both of their careers went supernova, almost in parallel. Johansson stepped into the Marvel Cinematic Universe in 2010 as Natasha Romanoff in Iron Man 2, a role that would come to define more than a decade of her professional life. Reynolds, meanwhile, was gearing up for Green Lantern, a film that mattered less for its box office performance and more for who he met on set, Blake Lively, the woman who would eventually become his wife. But 2010 was also the year the marriage itself started showing cracks. The couple separated that year, and in December they released a joint statement confirming the divorce, a statement notable, even at the time, for how measured it was. They said they'd entered the marriage with love and were leaving it the same way, after long and careful consideration. No accusations. No villain. Just an ending. The divorce was finalized before the year was out, closing a chapter that had lasted barely 2 years on paper, even less in practice. What filled the vacuum afterward was, predictably, speculation. Unnamed sources painted Reynolds as more traditional in his expectations of the marriage and Johansson as increasingly independent, the kind of narrative tabloids love because it's tidy, even when nobody involved has confirmed a word of it. Reynolds addressed the split only glancingly, telling one interviewer that anyone who goes through a divorce feels real pain, but framing it as something you move through rather than something that defines you. He leaned on his usual instinct for deflection, once joking that a flooded hotel room, a sick dog, and a broken finger during a rough shoot were nothing compared to going through a divorce in the middle of it all. Johansson, for her part, simply didn't engage. Not with journalists asking pointed questions. Not with the tabloid narrative building around her. She moved into her next chapter, a relationship with French journalist Romain Doriac that led to marriage in 2014 and a daughter, Rose, that same year, followed by another divorce in 2017, without ever circling back to explain what had actually happened with Reynolds. It wasn't evasiveness exactly. It read more like a woman who had already made peace with that chapter long before the public had any interest in doing the same. That silence held for 13 years. Then, in April 2023, Johansson sat down as a guest on her friend Gwyneth Paltrow's Goop podcast, and the whole thing unraveled in the most unplanned way imaginable. Paltrow, trying to tally up Johansson's marriages, guessed 2. Johansson corrected her, 3. And Paltrow, genuinely, visibly, drew a blank. "Oh, that's right," she said, catching herself, "because I forgot you were married to Ryan Reynolds." She even called it a missed opportunity, joking about how easy it was to overlook one of the more low-key unions in modern Hollywood history. What happened next is the part that made headlines. Johansson didn't get defensive or brush past it. She laughed, agreed the marriage hadn't lasted long, and noted it had overlapped with the earliest days of her friendship with Paltrow, right around the time she was filming Iron Man 2. When Paltrow said something like, "We love a good Ryan Reynolds in this house," Johansson didn't hesitate. She simply called him a good guy. 2 words, delivered with real warmth, and they did more to reshape the public's understanding of that marriage than a decade of tabloid guesswork ever had. But the more meaningful part of the exchange came right after, when Paltrow asked what Johansson had learned from her earlier relationships. Johansson's answer was unusually candid for someone who'd spent over 10 years saying almost nothing on the subject. She admitted that in her younger relationships, including, by clear implication, the one with Reynolds, she hadn't known how to set her own boundaries, and she hadn't yet figured out what she actually needed from another person. She talked about eventually identifying the more fundamental qualities she needed in a partner, things like compassion, and said it took learning to respect herself enough to name those needs out loud before a relationship like the one she has now, with her husband Colin Jost, became possible. It wasn't a confession about Reynolds specifically. She never criticized him, never assigned blame, never suggested he'd done anything wrong. If anything, the opposite. The affection in her voice when she called him a good guy was unmistakable. What she was really describing was herself at 23, a woman who loved fast and got married fast because that's what felt instinctive at the time, without yet having the self-knowledge to know what a lasting partnership actually required of her. It's a strikingly ordinary explanation for why so many early marriages end, delivered by someone who'd simply never said it out loud before. The same conversation gave a fuller picture of everything that came after Reynolds, for anyone keeping score. After the 2010 divorce, Johansson married Romain Doriac in 2014. They share their daughter Rose and separated in 2017. She married Colin Jost, the Saturday Night Live weekend update anchor, in 2020, and the two have a son, Cosmo, born in 2021. Jost has occasionally referenced his wife's career on air, including, more recently, joking about her box office standing after she was briefly overtaken as the highest-grossing actress of all time, before noting that his own film credits tipped the count back in her favor. Johansson has credited the relative calm of her marriage to Jost to simply knowing herself better by the time they got together, a direct callback to the exact lesson she described learning the hard way, years earlier, with Reynolds. Reynolds' life after the divorce went in an almost inverse direction, quieter internally, louder externally. He married Blake Lively in 2012, and the two built one of the most publicly visible families in entertainment, with 4 children together. There were persistent rumors for years that his relationship with Lively had started before his marriage to Johansson officially ended, largely fueled by a report describing the two of them on what looked like an early date not long after the divorce was announced. Reynolds has pushed back on that timeline directly, explaining that he and Lively were friends first, and that anything romantic didn't begin until roughly a year after they'd wrapped filming Green Lantern, when both of them were single, during what he's described as an awkwardly mismatched double date where they each ended up paired with someone else. No confirmed evidence has ever surfaced that contradicts his version of events. Since then, Reynolds has built a business empire that dwarfs his acting income in some years. Aviation American Gin, sold in part to Diageo in 2020, Mint Mobile, sold to T-Mobile in a deal that closed in 2023, and, alongside actor Rob McElhenney, ownership of the Welsh football club Wrexham AFC, which became the subject of a widely watched docuseries chronicling its climb through the English football pyramid. He also returned as Deadpool opposite Hugh Jackman's Wolverine in 2024, in a film that became one of the year's biggest box office successes. More recently, Reynolds' personal life has been pulled into headlines for reasons that have nothing to do with Johansson at all. He and Lively have been at the center of a high-profile legal dispute connected to her film It Ends With Us, involving her co-star and director Justin Baldoni, whom she has accused of sexual misconduct and orchestrating a smear campaign against her, allegations Baldoni denies. It's a reminder of just how differently public scrutiny has landed on each of them since their own marriage quietly dissolved a decade and a half ago. Johansson's chapter closed almost silently, while Reynolds, for better or worse, keeps generating noise. Johansson's own career, by contrast, has stayed rooted mostly in the work itself. Beyond her long run as Black Widow, she's taken on prestige dramatic roles in films like Marriage Story and Jojo Rabbit, both from 2019, and stepped behind the camera as a director for the first time with Eleanor the Great, starring June Squibb, which premiered in 2025. She's also built out a producing arm through her company These Pictures, with television projects reportedly in development. By some measures, she's become the highest-grossing lead actress in film history, with an estimated net worth in the neighborhood of $165 to $200 million, built on Marvel paychecks, endorsement deals, and her skincare line, The Outset. Strip away the tabloid framing and what's left is a much simpler story than the headlines ever made it sound. Two people got married young, quickly, and quietly. It didn't work, for reasons neither of them ever needed to publicly litigate. They ended it with a joint statement that was more graceful than most celebrity divorces manage, and then they just moved on, separately, without turning the split into content for anyone else to consume. For 13 years, that restraint meant the public got almost nothing to go on, which is exactly why one unscripted moment on a podcast, a friend forgetting a marriage had ever happened, ended up saying more than a decade of speculation could. Johansson wasn't making an announcement. She was correcting a friend's math in the middle of an unrelated conversation, and the honesty about her own younger self came out almost as an aside. That's probably why it landed the way it did, not as a performance, but as something closer to the truth. What she actually said, in the end, wasn't really about Ryan Reynolds at all. It was about a 23-year-old who got married on instinct, before she'd learned how to ask for what she needed. Reynolds, by every account since, remains someone she speaks of with real fondness. The marriage simply belonged to a version of her that no longer exists, and 13 years later, she finally said so, in 11 words, without meaning to say anything at all. If this breakdown gave you a clearer picture of what actually happened between them, share it with someone who's been wondering the same thing. And if you want more of these deep dives into the real stories behind Hollywood's most talked about relationships, stick around, there's more coming.